An arrogant CEO fired a janitor for feeding a puppy. What he didn't know was that a Navy SEAL was watching from the shadows, and what happened next would destroy everything the CEO had built. This is a story about power, cruelty, and the moment when someone finally said enough. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more stories of justice and courage. Marcus Webb was 38 years old, and he looked every year of it as he pushed his cleaning cart down the hallway of the Northbridge Financial Tower at 6:47 on a Tuesday evening in late October. His brown eyes, bloodshot from exhaustion, stared straight ahead as the fluorescent lights overhead hummed their mechanical drone. He wore navy blue work pants with permanent knee stains and a matching shirt with his name embroidered over the breast pocket in faded yellow thread. His hands, rough and calloused from years of manual labor, gripped the cart handle with the kind of unconscious strength that comes from repetition. The tower stood in downtown Charlotte, North Carolina, a gleaming monument of glass and steel that reflected the autumn sunset in shades of amber and crimson. Inside, the air conditioning kept the temperature at exactly 72 degrees, a stark contrast to the humid warmth still clinging to the streets below. The marble floors of the 23rd floor gleamed under Marcus's recent efforts, reflecting the recessed lighting like a dark mirror. The scent of industrial cleaner, sharp chemical, vaguely lemony, hung in the air, mixed with the lingering smell of expensive cologne from executives who departed hours earlier. Marcus had worked for Titan Maintenance Services for 11 years, assigned to the Northbridge Tower for the last 6. He knew every office, every corner, every stubborn stain in the executive suites. He knew which executives left their coffee cups on the edge of their desks, and which ones threw their trash toward the bin and missed. He knew the building better than most people who worked there knew their own homes. But what the people in those corner offices didn't know about Marcus Webb could fill volumes. They didn't know that he'd served 8 years in the Marine Corps, honorably discharged after taking shrapnel to his left leg during his second deployment to Afghanistan. They didn't know that he'd once led a fire team through hostile territory, that he'd earned a Purple Heart and a Navy Marine Corps Commendation Medal. They didn't know that the slight limp he carried was from a piece of metal still lodged too close to his femoral artery to safely remove. They didn't know that he worked the evening shift, 6 to midnight, 6 days a week, because his daughter Jasmine was 17 and battling acute lymphoblastic leukemia. They didn't know that his wife Rachel worked the day shift at a medical billing company, so one of them could always be at the hospital with Jasmine during her treatment cycles. They didn't know that Marcus's health insurance through Titan barely covered 20% of the medical bills, that their savings were gone, that they'd taken out a second mortgage on their small house in the Hickory Grove neighborhood. They didn't know that Marcus hadn't had a full night's sleep in 7 months. They didn't know, and they didn't care to know. To them, he was invisible, a shadow that moved through their world after hours, erasing evidence of their existence, preparing clean spaces for them to inhabit and soil again. Marcus stopped his cart outside the executive conference room and pulled out his key ring. The room was used sparingly, reserved for board meetings and high-stakes client presentations. It featured a table of polished mahogany that could seat 20, leather chairs that cost more than Marcus made in a month, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Charlotte skyline. He'd cleaned this room 1,000 times, and it still made his chest tight to think about the wealth represented in this single space. He unlocked the door and pushed his cart inside, then froze. A sound, soft, plaintive, a whimper. Marcus's head turned sharply toward the corner of the room, his military instincts kicking in before conscious thought caught up. Something moved in the shadows beneath the credenza, a dark shape, small, trembling. He approached slowly, knees creaking as he crouched down. His hand reached out, and his breath caught. A puppy, maybe 8 weeks old. German shepherd, by the looks of it, though the poor thing was painfully thin. Its fur was matted and dirty, ribs visible beneath the patchy coat. One ear stood up while the other flopped over, giving it a lopsided, heartbreaking appearance. The puppy's eyes, dark brown and enormous in its small face, looked up at Marcus with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Marcus's throat tightened. The puppy was shaking, whether from cold or terror or hunger. He couldn't tell. Probably all 3. He glanced around the room, trying to piece together how the animal had gotten here. The windows were sealed, climate-controlled. The door had been locked. Someone had brought this puppy up here. Someone had left it, abandoned it in this cold, sterile place 23 floors above the street. The puppy whimpered again, a sound so small and broken it made something crack in Marcus's chest. He'd seen suffering before. He'd seen it in the faces of Afghan villagers, caught between Taliban fighters and coalition forces. He'd seen it in the eyes of his daughter as chemotherapy ravaged her body. He'd learned to compartmentalize, to function despite the weight of it. But something about this tiny creature, helpless and abandoned, bypassed all his defenses. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out the turkey sandwich Rachel had packed for his dinner break. He'd been saving it, looking forward to those 30 minutes of sitting in the break room, letting his leg rest, maybe calling the hospital to check on Jasmine. He unwrapped the sandwich and tore off a piece of turkey, holding it out to the puppy. The animal's nose twitched, and after a moment's hesitation, it crept forward on unsteady legs and took the meat with surprising gentleness. Marcus watched as the puppy devoured it, then offered another piece. And another. The puppy ate like it hadn't seen food in days, which, Marcus thought grimly, was probably accurate. When the turkey was gone, Marcus poured water from his thermos into his cupped hand, letting the puppy lap it up. The animal's tiny tongue was rough and warm against his palm. After drinking, the puppy looked up at Marcus with something that might have been trust, or might have been the simple calculation that this human represented food and safety. Marcus sat back on his heels, mind racing. He couldn't leave the puppy here. Couldn't just abandon it after feeding it, let it starve or die of thirst or fall victim to whatever cruel person had left it in the first place. But he also couldn't afford to lose this job. The health insurance, as inadequate as it was, kept Jasmine in treatment. Losing it would be catastrophic. He looked at his cleaning cart. There was a storage bin at the bottom where he kept extra trash bags and cleaning solution bottles. He'd emptied it earlier that week, meaning to restock but never getting around to it. It was just big enough. Marcus made his decision in the space of a heartbeat. He pulled off his work shirt, leaving him in a white undershirt, and bundled the puppy gently in the fabric. The animal didn't struggle, just pressed against his chest, seeking warmth. Marcus placed the bundle carefully in the storage bin, making sure there was plenty of airflow, then arranged some trash bags loosely on top to hide the puppy from casual observation. He'd finish his shift. He'd take the puppy home. Rachel would understand. They'd figure it out. They always figured it out. Marcus stood, his leg protesting the movement, and returned to his work with renewed focus. He had 3 more floors to clean before he could leave. What Marcus didn't know was that he wasn't alone in the building. What he didn't know was that someone else was watching. Someone who'd notice everything that was about to unfold. Someone whose presence would change everything. The Northbridge Financial Tower was more than just a building. It was a statement. 47 stories of glass and brushed steel, designed by a Danish architect whose name appeared in all the marketing materials. The lobby featured a waterfall installation that cost $7 million and consumed enough water daily to supply a small neighborhood. The elevator banks were lined with Italian marble. The bathrooms on executive floors stocked with premium toiletries and heated toilet seats. Northbridge Capital Management occupied floors 20 through 27, an investment firm that managed portfolios for high-net-worth individuals and institutional clients. The company had been founded 32 years earlier by Thomas Northbridge Sr., built on aggressive trading strategies and willingness to take risks that more conservative firms avoided. When the elder Northbridge died of a heart attack 5 years ago, his son Thomas Northbridge Jr. had taken over as CEO. Jr., as he was never called to his face, was 34 years old and had inherited his father's company, his father's penthouse, and his father's belief that the world existed to serve him. What he hadn't inherited was his father's work ethic, his strategic mind, or his ability to inspire loyalty. Under Junior's leadership, Northbridge Capital had coasted on reputation and legacy clients, while newer, hungrier firms eroded their market share. The 23rd floor housed mid-level management and client services. The 27th floor, the executive suite, was where Junior spent his time when he bothered to come to the office at all, which averaged about 15 hours a week. His corner office featured a wet bar, a private bathroom with a shower, and a leather couch that cost $40,000 and had never been sat on. Tonight, October 17th, the building was mostly empty. A few analysts worked late on the 21st floor, racing against a deadline. 2 cleaning staff worked the lower floors, and Marcus Webb worked the executive levels, invisible and unnoticed, exactly as the world preferred him. But in the lobby cafe, closed for the day but accessible through a side entrance with the right keycard, one more person remained in the building. A man sat alone at a corner table, a cup of black coffee growing cold in front of him. He'd been there for 2 hours, had consumed 3 cups before this one, had nodded politely to the evening security guard who checked his visitor badge and waved him through. The badge said his name was James Keller, visiting from a consulting firm conducting a security assessment. The badge was legitimate, obtained through proper channels, and would hold up to scrutiny. The man was 31 years old, though he looked older in the way that military service ages a person. He stood 6 feet tall with a lean, athletic build that spoke of functional strength rather than gym vanity. His hair was dark brown, cut short but not military regulation short. His eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds, and they missed nothing. He wore dark jeans, a black Henley shirt, and a canvas jacket that concealed the fact that he was carrying a concealed weapon in a hip holster, legally, with proper permits, but still. His name wasn't James Keller. His name was Ryan Cross, and he was a petty officer first class in the United States Navy, attached to Naval Special Warfare Group 2, a Navy SEAL. He completed 5 deployments, 3 to Afghanistan and 2 to undisclosed locations that didn't appear in official records. He jumped from planes at 30,000 feet, conducted shipboarding operations in hostile waters, and spent more nights sleeping on rocky ground than in actual beds. He was on leave. 2 weeks of mandated rest before his team deployed again, this time to the Pacific Theater. He'd grown up in Charlotte, enlisted at 18 to escape a chaotic home life, and hadn't been back to his hometown in 4 years. When he'd flown in 3 days ago, he'd expected to feel something, nostalgia, maybe, or regret. Instead, he'd felt nothing. The city had changed. He'd changed more. Ryan had checked into a downtown hotel, intending to visit old haunts, maybe look up a few people from high school. Instead, he'd found himself walking the streets at night, unable to sleep, unable to settle. Combat had rewired something in his brain, made rest feel like vulnerability. He discovered the Northbridge Tower Cafe by accident, found it open late for building workers, and appreciated its quiet and its strong coffee. He'd been sitting here for 2 hours, reading a paperback thriller that failed to hold his attention, when movement caught his eye. A janitor pushing a cleaning cart. Older guy, maybe late 30s, with a slight limp that Ryan recognized immediately as combat-related. The way he moved, the way he scanned the space before entering, the unconscious situational awareness. Military training left marks. Ryan watched the janitor disappear into the elevator bank, heading up to the higher floors. He returned to his book, but found his attention drifting. Something about seeing another veteran, someone who'd clearly fallen on harder times, settled uncomfortably in his chest. It could have been him. Without the SEAL teams, without that structure and purpose, it might be him pushing that cart, invisible to the world. Ryan checked his watch. 8:30. He should head back to the hotel, try to sleep, stop brooding in empty cafes. But something kept him in his seat. An instinct, maybe. The sense that he was supposed to be here, right now, in this moment. SEALs learn to trust their instincts. Those instincts kept you alive when intelligence failed, when plans fell apart, when everything went sideways, and only your gut could guide you home. Ryan settled back in his chair and waited, though he couldn't have said what he was waiting for. Ryan had learned patience in the teams. He'd spent 16 hours lying motionless in mud, watching a target building, waiting for a high-value individual to appear. He treaded water for 40 minutes in the Arabian Sea, waiting for extraction, fighting hypothermia and sharks and the simple human urge to panic. Patience wasn't natural to him. He'd been a hyperactive kid, always in trouble, always pushing boundaries, but the Navy had beaten it into him through countless hours of training and operational necessity. So sitting in a cafe for another hour, Nursing cold coffee and watching the building's rhythm didn't bother him. He observed the security guard making his rounds, the pattern predictable and professional. He noted the camera positions, the blind spots, the emergency exits. Old habits. He couldn't enter a space without cataloging how to escape it. Couldn't look at a crowd without identifying threats. At 9:45, movement in the lobby caught his attention. The elevator doors opened, and two men stepped out. Ryan's posture didn't change, but every muscle in his body shifted to a different state of readiness. Years of training had taught him to recognize predators, and these two men broadcast it in every movement. The first man was in his mid-30s, dressed in clothes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Custom-tailored charcoal suit, no tie, white shirt unbuttoned at the collar in calculated casualness. His hair was styled with product that made it look artfully messy, and he wore a watch that Ryan recognized as a Patek Philippe, probably worth $80,000. He was handsome in the way wealthy people often are. Good genetics maintained by expensive dentistry, personal trainers, and dermatologists. But his eyes ruined the picture. They were cold, entitled, cruel. They swept the lobby like he was surveying his kingdom, and they held the kind of contempt that comes from never being told no. The second man was older, late 40s, dressed less ostentatiously, but still expensive. Tailored blazer over dark jeans, leather shoes that gleamed. He carried himself with the nervous energy of a lieutenant, someone who'd attached himself to power and lived in constant fear of being cast out. Ryan recognized the dynamic immediately. Alpha and Beta, Predator and Remora. He'd seen it in military units sometimes, toxic leaders who surrounded themselves with yes-men and destroyed unit cohesion. He'd also seen it in enemy compounds, warlords and their lackeys. The security guard straightened as the men approached, his body language shifting to deference. The younger man, the Alpha, said something Ryan couldn't hear, and the guard laughed too loud at whatever joke had been made. The men moved toward the elevator bank, and Ryan thought that would be the end of it. Then the elevator dinged again, and the janitor emerged, pushing his cleaning cart. Ryan sat forward slightly, his gray eyes tracking the interaction with predatory focus. The janitor, the veteran, Ryan was certain now, looked exhausted. His shoulders sagged, his movements were automatic, and his eyes were fixed on the exit. He was done for the night, finished with his shift, probably thinking about getting home to whatever waited for him there. The two wealthy men stopped. The younger one's head turned, tracking the janitor's movement with sudden, focused attention. He said something to his companion, who smirked. Ryan felt his jaw tighten. He'd seen this before, too. Predators selecting prey. The calculation, the anticipation. It was the same whether you were in a bar in Virginia Beach watching SEALs pick fights or in a compound in Kandahar watching Taliban fighters single out the weakest village. The janitor didn't notice. He was focused on his cart, on leaving, on the exit that promised escape from another long shift. He pushed his cart toward the door, limping slightly, and Ryan could see the tension in the man's shoulders, the way he held himself like someone carrying an invisible weight. The younger, wealthy man stepped into the janitor's path. It looked accidental. Could have been accidental. But Ryan had spent years studying human movement, reading body language, identifying hostile intent before it manifested in violence. This was intentional. This was a power play. The janitor stopped, startled. He mumbled something, an apology, probably, and tried to maneuver his cart around the obstacle. The wealthy man shifted, blocking him again. His companion laughed, the sound sharp and cruel in the marble lobby. Ryan's hands flattened on the table. His breathing slowed, deepened. Combat breathing. Tactical assessment mode. The janitor's face was visible now in profile. Confusion, then understanding, then resignation. The look of someone who'd been through this before, who knew how this game ended, who'd learned that fighting back only made it worse. Ryan recognized that look. He'd seen it on the faces of Afghan interpreters dealing with corrupt police. He'd seen it on the faces of junior enlisted sailors dealing with abusive chiefs. He'd seen it in the mirror years ago when he'd been a skinny kid dealing with his stepfather's rages. The wealthy man said something, his voice carrying across the lobby now. Ryan caught fragments. More careful where you're going. Could have damaged people like you. The janitor's head dropped. He nodded, accepting blame for something that wasn't his fault, and tried once more to move around the obstacle. This time, the wealthy man let him pass, but as the janitor pushed his cart forward, the man's hand shot out and shoved the cart hard. It rolled into the janitor's hip, making him stumble. His leg, the injured one, buckled slightly, and he caught himself on the cart's handle. The wealthy man and his companion laughed and headed back toward the elevators. Their sport concluded. The janitor stood frozen for a moment, hands gripping his cart, head still down. Then he continued toward the exit, moving faster now, desperate to escape before something else happened. Ryan watched him go, watched the security guard studiously ignore the entire interaction, watched the two wealthy men disappear into the elevator, already forgetting the janitor existed. Something cold and hard settled in Ryan's chest. He knew he should let it go. The janitor was fine, physically. It was just ego, just power games, just the casual cruelty that people with money inflicted on people without it every day in 1,000 ways. But Ryan had become a SEAL because he couldn't let things go. Because when he saw injustice, saw bullies preying on the weak, something in him demanded action. It had gotten him in trouble as a kid, starting fights with older boys who picked on younger ones. It had nearly derailed his military career early on when he'd confronted a senior officer about mistreatment of junior enlisted. It had also made him exceptional at his job, because he couldn't stand by and watch innocents suffer. The SEAL ethos was clear. I will not fail those with whom I serve. But for Ryan, that had always extended beyond his team. It meant everyone who couldn't protect themselves. Everyone who the world had decided didn't matter. He checked his watch. 10:05. He should leave. Should go back to the hotel. Should mind his own business. Instead, Ryan settled deeper into his chair, ordered another coffee from the night attendant who'd just returned from a break, and waited. His instinct had told him to stay, and now he knew why. This wasn't over. Men like those two didn't stop with one act of cruelty. They escalated. They fed on it. And something told Ryan that the janitor's night was about to get much worse. He'd wait. He'd watch. And if his instinct proved correct, he'd do what he'd been trained to do. Protect those who couldn't protect themselves, even if they didn't know they needed protecting yet. Thomas Northbridge, Jr. felt a familiar rush of power as the elevator climbed toward the executive floor. He loved this building at night, loved having it to himself, loved the way his footsteps echoed in empty hallways that during business hours teemed with employees who scattered like roaches when he approached. This was his kingdom. His father had built it, but it was his now, and everyone in it existed at his pleasure. His companion, Derek Vance, stood beside him in the elevator, checking his phone with the nervous energy that Thomas found both useful and contemptible. Derek was the company's chief financial officer, a title that sounded impressive, but really just meant he was Thomas's cleanup crew, the man who made the numbers look good and who knew where all the bodies were buried. Figuratively speaking. Mostly. Thomas was in a good mood tonight. He'd closed a deal that afternoon, convinced a pension fund to invest $40 million into one of Northbridge Capital's riskier funds, the kind with high management fees and performance guarantees that Thomas knew they'd never hit. But that was the fund manager's problem. His problem was extracting maximum profit, and he'd done that beautifully. The elevator opened on 27, and Thomas stepped into his domain. The executive floor was a testament to his taste and his father's money. Hardwood floors, original art on the walls, a Liechtenstein in the reception area, a Warhol in the conference room, and furniture that prioritized aesthetics over comfort, because comfort was for people who actually worked for a living. Thomas headed toward his office, Derek trailing behind. They'd come back to the building ostensibly to retrieve some documents Derek claimed they needed for tomorrow's board meeting, but really because Thomas wanted to, because he could. Because showing up unannounced kept employees nervous, kept them from getting too comfortable, reminded them that he might appear at any moment to judge them. He unlocked his office door and flipped on the lights. The space was exactly as he'd left it, pristine, organized, maintained by staff who knew better than to move anything even a fraction of an inch from its designated position. His desk was a slab of Brazilian rosewood that weighed 800 pounds. His chair was ergonomic leather that had required a specialist to adjust to his exact specifications. The view through his floor-to-ceiling windows showcased Charlotte's skyline, a vista of lights and power that never failed to satisfy something deep in his chest. Thomas poured himself a scotch from the crystal decanter on his sidebar, Macallan 50-year-old, for $1,000 a bottle. He didn't particularly like scotch, but he liked the statement it made. Derek accepted a glass with murmured thanks and took a small, nervous sip. They'd been discussing next quarter's projections for 10 minutes when Thomas heard it. A sound faint but distinct. A whimper. Almost like a... His head turned sharply toward the door. Derek fell silent mid-sentence. There it was again. Definitely animal. Definitely in the building. Thomas's mood shifted instantly from satisfied to irritated. This was his building, his floor, his space. Nothing happened here without his knowledge and permission. The presence of an animal, some stray that had probably wandered in through a loading dock, was an affront, a violation of the order he demanded. He stood, leaving his scotch on the desk, and moved into the hallway. Derek followed, reading the change in his boss's demeanor and falling into lieutenant mode, alert, ready to agree with whatever Thomas decided. The sound came again, louder now, coming from the conference room at the end of the hall. Thomas strode toward it, his footsteps sharp against the hardwood. He tried the door, locked, which was proper protocol, but he had keys to every lock in the building. He'd insisted on it when he'd taken over as CEO, overriding the facilities manager's protests about security. Thomas Northbridge Jr. didn't accept locked doors in his own building. He unlocked the conference room and pushed the door open. For a moment, he didn't understand what he was seeing. The room was dark except for the city lights filtering through the windows. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw movement near his cleaning cart. No, not his cleaning cart. The janitor's cart. That older guy. The one with the limp. The one Thomas had enjoyed messing with downstairs. The cart was here, parked against the wall, and next to it, a puppy. German Shepherd, small, pathetically skinny. It was drinking water from what looked like a plastic container lid, lapping desperately. Thomas's irritation crystallized into something sharper. Rage. A janitor had brought an animal into his building, into his executive floor, into the conference room where Thomas met with clients, where million-dollar deals were negotiated, where the future of his company was decided. An animal. A disease-ridden, flea-infested, disgusting animal. The puppy noticed him. It froze, water dripping from its muzzle, eyes wide. Then it scrambled backward, slipping on the smooth floor, and huddled against the credenza. Derek appeared at Thomas's shoulder. He saw the puppy and let out a low whistle. "That dog shouldn't be here," he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone stating the obvious in hopes of being praised for his observation. Thomas didn't respond. His mind was racing, not with concern for the animal, but with the implications. This was a violation, a firing offense. More than that, it was an opportunity. He'd been looking for an excuse to shake things up with the building management, to demonstrate his power, to remind everyone that he was watching and that nothing escaped his notice. He pulled out his phone and opened the building directory, found the facilities manager's number. It was after 10, but that didn't matter. When Thomas Northbridge Jr. called, the facilities manager picked up on the third ring, voice thick with sleep. Thomas didn't waste time with pleasantries. He explained the situation in sharp, clipped sentences, his voice cold with fury. There was an animal in his executive conference room. He wanted to know how this had happened. He wanted to know who was responsible. And he wanted that person fired immediately. The facilities manager stammered something about procedures, about investigating, about determining facts. Thomas cut him off. He didn't care about procedures. He didn't care about facts. He knew exactly who was responsible. The janitor who'd just left the building with that cart. The older one, with the limp. Thomas wanted him fired. Tonight. Not tomorrow. Not after an investigation. Tonight. The facilities manager tried to explain that he didn't have the authority, that the janitor worked for Titan Maintenance Services, that there were labor laws and protocols. Thomas's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. He reminded the facilities manager that Northbridge Capital paid $40,000 a month for building services. He reminded him that contracts could be terminated. He suggested that if the facilities manager couldn't handle this simple task, Perhaps Thomas needed to find someone who could. The facility's manager's resistance crumbled. He promised to contact Titan Maintenance immediately. He promised the janitor would be terminated. He promised it would never happen again. Thomas ended the call and looked at Derek, who was watching with the fascinated horror of someone witnessing an execution. Derek knew better than to comment, knew better than to suggest mercy or proportion. He'd learned early that Thomas Northbridge Jr. didn't accept challenges to his authority, no matter how small. But the puppy remained, still cowering against the credenza. Thomas stared at it, considering options. He could call animal control, but that would take time, and he wanted the creature gone now. He could pick it up and throw it out a window, but that was 23 stories, and even Thomas recognized that visible animal cruelty might create problems. He settled for a compromise. He moved toward the puppy, which scrambled further into the corner, whimpering. Thomas grabbed the nearest object, a leather portfolio from the conference table, and threw it at the animal. It missed, but the puppy yelped and tried to squeeze itself into an impossibly small space. Derek shifted uncomfortably. Thomas noticed and felt a flash of contempt. Weakness. Sentimentality. His father had warned him about keeping people around who couldn't handle difficult decisions. Thomas pulled out his phone again and called building security. When the guard answered, Thomas ordered him to come to the 23rd floor conference room immediately and remove an animal. The guard promised to bring a carrier and animal control's number. Thomas didn't care about the details, just wanted it handled. He walked back to his office, Derek following, and returned to his scotch. His good mood was ruined, replaced by simmering anger that he knew from experience would take hours to fade. But there was satisfaction beneath the anger. He'd identified a problem and solved it. He'd exercised his power and watched people scramble to comply. The janitor would be fired, the building management would be terrified, and everyone would be reminded that Thomas Northbridge Jr. saw everything and tolerated nothing. What Thomas didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that someone else had seen everything too. Someone who'd followed the janitor back into the building, invisible in the shadows, watching and cataloging every moment. Someone who was currently reviewing the last 15 minutes and making calculations that would have chilled Thomas's blood if he'd been capable of recognizing danger. Ryan Cross had remained in the cafe until he'd seen the janitor exit the building, then watched as the man crossed the parking garage toward an ancient Honda Civic that barely looked roadworthy. The janitor had loaded his cart into the trunk. It took 3 tries to get the latch to catch, and then pulled a bundle of fabric from the storage compartment. Even from a distance, Ryan had recognized the shape, the movement, the careful way the janitor cradled it. An animal. The janitor had smuggled an animal out of the building. Ryan had felt a flicker of respect. Small act of rebellion. Small act of mercy. The kind of thing that didn't change the world, but said something about the person doing it. Then the janitor had frozen, staring at the bundle, had reached inside and pulled something out. A phone, Ryan realized. The man's face, illuminated by the screen, had gone through a series of expressions: confusion, shock, devastation. The janitor had made a phone call, brief and clearly distressing. Then he'd carefully placed the bundle back in his car, locked it. The driver's side lock didn't work, so he'd had to lean across from the passenger side and headed back toward the building at a limping run. Ryan had followed, not closely enough to be noticed, but close enough to see the janitor re-enter through the service entrance, key card trembling in his hand. Close enough to watch him take the elevator up. Close enough to see the 2 wealthy men from earlier also return to the building, using the main entrance, and head to the executive floors. Ryan had stayed in the lobby, invisible to the security guard who'd returned to his station and his phone. He'd positioned himself where he could monitor the elevator bank, the exits, the flow of movement. And when the security guard had received a phone call and headed up to the executive floors with a cat carrier from the emergency pet kit the building apparently maintained, Ryan had known exactly what was happening. He'd known, and he'd made his own calculations. The 2 wealthy men would view this as a victory. The janitor would view it as a catastrophe. The power dynamic was clear, the outcome predetermined. But the 2 wealthy men didn't know that a Navy SEAL was watching, didn't know that the invisible observer in the cafe had training in insurgency, counterinsurgency, and asymmetric warfare. Didn't know that Ryan Cross had spent years learning how to identify, target, and neutralize threats. And make no mistake, Ryan had identified these men as threats, not to national security, not to military objectives, but to something more fundamental, to the basic human dignity that Ryan had sworn to protect, even if most people didn't realize that was part of the job. Ryan moved to a different position in the lobby, one with a clear view of the elevator bank and the garage entrance. He pulled out his phone and opened the camera app, making sure it was set to video mode. He'd learned in the teams that documentation mattered, that evidence was power, that the difference between a justified action and a war crime often came down to what you could prove happened. He wasn't sure yet what he was going to do. Wasn't sure this situation required his intervention, but he was sure that if it did, he'd be ready. So Ryan waited, patient as a hunter, and watched the pieces move into position. Marcus Webb's hand shook as he exited the elevator on the 23rd floor. The phone call from his supervisor at Titan Maintenance Services still echoed in his ears. "You're terminated, effective immediately. Security complaint. Unauthorized animal in the building. Turn in your keys. Clean out your locker. Don't come back." He tried to explain. Tried to say he'd found the puppy abandoned, that he was just trying to help, that he'd never meant any harm. His supervisor had cut him off. The client had demanded his firing. The client was always right. The decision was final. Marcus had hung up and sat in his car for 30 seconds, mind racing. The puppy was in his back seat, wrapped in his work shirt, finally quiet after whimpering for the entire elevator ride down. He'd been planning to take it to a shelter in the morning, to find it help, to do the right thing. Now he was fired. Fired, which meant no more health insurance, which meant Jasmine's treatment would stop, which meant everything he and Rachel had been fighting for was gone, because he'd fed a starving puppy. The unfairness of it was crushing, overwhelming. Marcus had survived combat. He'd survived watching friends die. He'd survived the slow horror of watching his daughter waste away. But this somehow broke something in him. He'd left the puppy in the car, safely, with the windows cracked and water in a bowl, and come back inside. He didn't have a plan. Didn't know what he was doing. He just knew he couldn't let this happen without at least trying to explain, to beg, to fix it somehow. The elevator doors opened, and Marcus stepped onto the executive floor. The lights were on in the conference room. He could see movement inside. Security, probably. Handling the puppy he'd left behind. No, not left behind. The puppy had been in his cart, hidden. He'd been planning to take it home. He'd just been doing his job, finishing his shift, when he'd been fired. Someone had found it. Someone had reported it. Someone had cost him everything over an act of mercy. Marcus walked toward the conference room, his limp more pronounced now because adrenaline made his leg throb. The security guard was just exiting with the cat carrier. Inside, Marcus could see the puppy, the tiny German shepherd with the lopsided ears, huddled in the carrier, terrified. The guard saw Marcus and stopped. His expression shifted through surprise, concern, and then professional wariness. He knew. Everyone probably knew by now. The crazy janitor who brought a dog to work. The idiot who threw away his job for an animal. Marcus ignored him and looked past him into the conference room. Two men stood there. The younger one in the expensive suit, the one who'd shoved Marcus's cart in the lobby earlier, and his companion, older, nervous. The younger man's eyes met Marcus's, and Marcus saw the recognition, saw the amusement, saw the complete lack of remorse. Something snapped. Marcus had been trained by the Marine Corps to control his emotions, to function under stress, to make calculated decisions. But there were limits. Everyone had limits, and Marcus Webb had just found his. He stepped into the conference room. The security guard called after him. "Sir, you need to leave. Sir, you're trespassing." But Marcus didn't hear him. His entire world had narrowed to the man in the suit, the man who destroyed his life over nothing. "Do you know what you've done?" Marcus's voice was rough, strained. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Thomas Northbridge Jr. looked at him with the detached interest of someone observing an insect. "I know exactly what I've done. I've had a rule violation addressed. You brought an animal into my building, into an executive space, and you were rightfully terminated." Marcus took another step forward. The security guard was behind him now, hand on his radio, calling for backup. Marcus didn't care. That puppy was abandoned, Marcus said, his voice rising. Someone left it here to die. I was trying to help it. I fed it my own dinner. I gave it water. I was going to take it to a shelter. Thomas's expression didn't change. That's not my concern. Your job was to clean this building, not to rescue animals. You violated company policy and compromised the hygiene of a client space. The consequences are appropriate. Marcus felt tears burning behind his eyes and hated himself for it. I have a daughter, he said, his voice breaking. She's 17. She has cancer. I just lost my health insurance because I saved a starving puppy. Do you understand that? My daughter is going to die because you couldn't show 1 ounce of human decency. For the first time, something flickered across Thomas Northbridge Jr.'s face. Not compassion, not remorse, annoyance. Your personal problems aren't my responsibility, he said coldly. You made a choice that violated policy. You face consequences. That's how the world works. Derek Vance, standing behind Thomas, shifted uncomfortably. The security guard's hand was on Marcus's arm now, trying to pull him toward the door. Marcus resisted, his combat training making him immovable when he chose to be. You're a monster, Marcus said quietly. You're everything that's wrong with this world. You have everything, and it's not enough. You have to take from people who have nothing. You have to crush people for the crime of showing mercy. Thomas's eyes hardened. The security guard pulled harder on Marcus's arm. 2 more guards arrived, summoned by the radio call, and now Marcus was being physically removed from the room. He didn't resist, but he held Thomas's gaze. I hope someday you understand, Marcus said. I hope someday someone makes you understand what you've done. Then he was in the hallway, being escorted to the elevator. The security guards were professional but firm. He needed to leave the building immediately. He was no longer an employee. If he returned, it would be considered trespassing. Marcus let them guide him. The fight had drained out of him as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only exhaustion and despair. He'd made everything worse. He'd burned the bridge completely. Now Thomas Northbridge Jr. knew his face, knew his name, and would probably ensure he never worked in Charlotte again. The elevator ride down was silent. The guards released him in the lobby, watching to ensure he exited. Marcus walked through the doors into the October night, the humid air wrapping around him like a shroud. His car sat in the parking garage, where he'd left it. Inside, the puppy was curled up on his work shirt, sleeping finally, its small body rising and falling with each breath. Marcus got behind the wheel and gripped it so hard his knuckles went white. He didn't cry. He'd learned a long time ago that crying didn't fix anything. But he sat there for a long time, trying to figure out how he was going to tell Rachel that everything had fallen apart. Inside the building, Thomas Northbridge Jr. returned to his office and finished his scotch. The encounter with the janitor had been unpleasant, but it had also been affirming. The man had tried to appeal to his humanity, tried to make him feel guilty, and Thomas had felt nothing. That was power. That was strength. His father would have approved. Derek suggested they leave. It was late. The situation was handled, and Thomas agreed. They took the elevator down, discussing tomorrow's board meeting as though nothing had happened. They exited into the lobby and headed for the parking garage. Thomas was thinking about which restaurant to hit for a late dinner when a voice stopped him. "Excuse me." Thomas turned. A man had stepped away from one of the lobby columns. Tall, athletic build, dark hair, civilian clothes, but something in his bearing suggested military. Thomas's irritation spiked. Another employee? Another problem? The man approached with calm, measured steps. His gray eyes were fixed on Thomas with an intensity that made Derek take a half step backward. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation upstairs," the man said. His voice was quiet, controlled. "You fired a man for feeding a starving puppy." Thomas felt his hackles rise. "Who the hell are you?" The man ignored the question. "That man you fired is a veteran. Marine Corps. He served his country while you were probably spending Daddy's money on bottle service. And you destroyed his life because he showed compassion." Thomas's face flushed. "This is none of your business. I don't know who you are or what you think you're doing, but you need to leave before I have security remove you too." The man didn't move. I'm making it my business. Thomas pulled out his phone. One call, and security would drag this guy out. One more call, and Charlotte PD would arrest him for trespassing and harassment. Thomas had lawyers, connections, power. But before he could dial, the man spoke again. My name is Petty Officer First Class Ryan Cross, United States Navy, Naval Special Warfare Group 2. My military ID is in my right jacket pocket. I'm going to retrieve it slowly. I suggest you watch what I'm about to show you. Ryan's hand moved to his pocket with deliberate care. He pulled out a leather credential case and flipped it open. Thomas stared at the ID. Golden Eagle crest. Department of Defense seal. Photograph of the man standing in front of him in dress uniform. Holographic authentication strip. The words Naval Special Warfare Group 2. A Navy SEAL. This random guy in the lobby was a Navy SEAL. Derek made a small sound in his throat. Thomas felt his confidence waver, then reassert itself. So what? Military credentials didn't give this man authority over him. This was civilian jurisdiction. This was Thomas's building. This man had no power here. That's very impressive, Thomas said, his voice dripping sarcasm. But unless you're here on official military business, you're just another civilian. And right now, you're trespassing. Ryan closed his credential case and returned it to his pocket. Then he pulled out his phone. I recorded the incident upstairs, he said calmly. I have video of you verbally abusing a disabled veteran. I have audio of you admitting you fired him for an act of mercy. I have evidence of your complete lack of remorse when informed that your actions would harm a child with cancer. Thomas felt his stomach drop. Recording him? In his own building? That's illegal, Derek blurted out. You can't record people without consent. Ryan's eyes shifted to Derek for the first time. North Carolina is a one-party consent state. I only need my own consent to record a conversation I'm part of or witnessing. And since your boss was speaking loud enough for anyone in the vicinity to hear, he had no reasonable expectation of privacy. He looked back at Thomas. I'm going to offer you a choice. You can call the building management company right now and tell them to reinstate Marcus Webb with full back pay and benefits. You can apologize for your behavior, and you can let this end here. Thomas found his voice again. And if I don't, then I send this recording to every news outlet in Charlotte. I send it to social media. I send it to veteran advocacy groups. And I watch your company's reputation burn while you become famous as the entitled CEO who ruined a disabled veteran's life over a puppy. Thomas's mind raced. This was a bluff. Had to be a bluff. Even if the recording existed, even if it was legal, it wouldn't matter. People like Thomas didn't face real consequences. The world didn't work that way. Do your worst, Thomas said, his voice cold. I have lawyers who will bury you. I have connections that will make sure no one cares about your little video. You're nobody. I'm Thomas Northbridge, Jr. This is my city. Ryan nodded slowly, as if Thomas had confirmed something. Okay, he said. Then he pulled out his phone and started typing. What are you doing? Derek demanded. Sending the video to the Charlotte Observer, Ryan said without looking up, and the local NBC affiliate, and WFAE Public Radio, and about a dozen veteran support organizations. Should take about 2 minutes. Thomas lunged forward, trying to grab the phone. It was instinct, stupid, the reaction of someone who'd never faced real physical opposition. Ryan moved. One smooth step backward, one hand guiding Thomas's wrist away, and suddenly Thomas was off balance, stumbling, Derek catching him before he fell. The security guard who'd been watching from his station was on his radio now, calling for backup again. But Ryan just stepped back, phone still in hand, fingers still moving. You just assaulted me, Thomas snarled. That guard saw it. You're going to jail. Ryan looked up from his phone. I defended myself from your assault. The guard saw you lunge at me. The camera saw it too. But please, call the police. I'd love to explain to them why you attacked me. Thomas's phone buzzed. Derek's buzzed too. They both looked at their screens. An email notification. From an unknown address. Subject line. Evidence of corporate abuse. Charlotte executive fires disabled veteran for helping puppy. The email contained a link to a video file hosted on a cloud service. Below it, a message. This video will be released to media outlets in 48 hours unless Marcus Webb is reinstated with full benefits and back pay, and a public apology is issued. Thomas looked up at Ryan, his face white with rage. This is blackmail. Ryan shook his head. This is consequences. Something I suspect you're not familiar with. You have 48 hours to make this right. If you don't, the world will know exactly what kind of person you are. He turned and walked toward the exit. The security guard, confused and overwhelmed, didn't try to stop him. Thomas stood in the lobby, Derek beside him, both of them staring at their phones. Around them, the building hummed with its nighttime sounds, ventilation, distant traffic, the soft ding of elevator bells. For the first time in his life, Thomas Northbridge Jr. felt something unfamiliar, something cold and unpleasant, something that might have been fear. Ryan Cross walked out of the Northbridge Financial Tower into the October night, his heart rate barely elevated despite the confrontation. He'd faced down-armed insurgents in close-quarters combat. He'd been shot at, blown up, and nearly drowned. One entitled CEO having a tantrum didn't register as stress. But he was angry. Cold, controlled anger that settled in his chest like ice. He'd seen too many good people destroyed by people like Thomas Northbridge Jr., people who wielded power without responsibility, who inflicted cruelty without consequence, who moved through the world secure in their invulnerability. Ryan had spent his military career creating consequences for people who thought themselves untouchable. Terrorist leaders who believed they were safe in fortified compounds. Warlords who thought their militias made them invincible. Pirates who assumed international waters meant immunity. They'd all learned differently. Now Ryan was going to teach Thomas Northbridge Jr. the same lesson. He walked to his rental car, a nondescript sedan parked 2 blocks away. SEALs learned to never park too close to target locations, to maintain operational security, to always have an exit strategy. Old habits. Inside the car, Ryan pulled out his laptop and connected it to his phone's hotspot. He uploaded the video he'd recorded to 3 separate cloud services, ensuring redundancy. Then he began compiling information. Thomas Northbridge Jr., age 34. CEO of Northbridge Capital Management. Inherited position from father 5 years ago. Company managed $4.2 billion in assets. Thomas personally lived in a penthouse in the South Park neighborhood, valued at $6.8 million. He drove a Bentley Continental GT, served on the board of 2 charitable foundations, and was photographed frequently at high society events with various blonde women, who all looked vaguely similar. Ryan dug deeper. Public records showed Thomas had been arrested once at age 22 for DUI. Charges dropped after his father's lawyers got involved. He'd been named in a sexual harassment lawsuit by a former employee 3 years ago, settled out of court with an NDA. Business filings showed Northbridge Capital's performance had declined steadily since Thomas took over, losing clients to competitors despite the overall bull market. More searching revealed that Northbridge Capital was currently under quiet investigation by the SEC for possible insider trading violations. Nothing public yet, but Ryan knew how to navigate government databases from his intelligence training. The investigation had been opened 6 months ago, triggered by suspicious trading patterns in one of their managed funds. Ryan sat back, piecing together the picture. Thomas Northbridge Jr. was a failing CEO propped up by his father's reputation and family money. He was likely insecure about his performance, desperate to maintain control, and willing to abuse anyone who reminded him of his inadequacy. The janitor, Marcus Webb, had represented everything Thomas wasn't. Service, sacrifice, humility, actual work. Thomas had seen that and needed to destroy it, to reassert his superiority over someone society deemed lesser. Ryan understood the psychology. He'd studied it in training, seen it in enemy combatants, recognized it in toxic military leaders. Weak men who needed to hurt others, to feel strong. But knowing the psychology didn't make it acceptable. It made it more contemptible. Ryan pulled up Marcus Webb's information next. It took longer. Military records required access Ryan technically shouldn't have, but the SEAL community was tight-knit, and he had friends in personnel. Within an hour, he had Marcus's service record. Lance Corporal Marcus Webb. 8 years, Marine Corps Infantry. 2 deployments to Afghanistan. Purple Heart for wounds received in Helmand Province. Navy Marine Corps Commendation Medal for actions during a firefight where his fire team had held a position against 50 Taliban fighters for 4 hours until air support arrived. Honorable discharge. Medical separation due to injuries. Current employment, Titan Maintenance Services, earning $14 an hour. No other income reported. Daughter Jasmine Webb, age 17, diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 14 months ago. Medical expenses exceeding $400,000, most unpaid. House and foreclosure process. Wife Rachel Webb, working full-time in medical billing. The Marcus Webb in these files was a hero. An actual hero, not the Hollywood kind. The kind who'd done his job under fire, protected his Marines, come home broken, and kept going anyway. The kind who worked a minimum wage night shift so his daughter could have insurance, so his family could survive one more month. And Thomas Northbridge Jr. had destroyed him over a puppy. Ryan felt his anger crystallize into purpose. This wasn't just about one confrontation anymore. This was about a system that allowed people like Thomas to crush people like Marcus. This was about a society that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion. This was personal now. Ryan made a series of calls. First, to a former team member who now worked as a private investigator in D.C. He needed deep background on Thomas Northbridge Jr., everything that wasn't in public records. Second, to a lawyer friend from his hometown, someone who specialized in employment law. Third, to a contact at the Charlotte Observer, a journalist who'd written favorably about veteran issues. Each call was brief, professional. Ryan didn't explain much, just requested information and assistance. SEALs were good at building networks, at knowing who to call when a mission required specialized expertise. By 2 in the morning, Ryan had what he needed. A comprehensive file on Thomas Northbridge Jr., including the details of the settled harassment suit, photographs from a college hazing incident that suggested assault, and testimony from former employees about a pattern of abusive behavior. He also had, at 7 a.m., Ryan drove to the address he'd found for Marcus Webb. The house was in a working-class neighborhood, small homes with chain-link fences and cars that had seen better decades. Marcus's house was easy to identify. The lawn was overgrown, not from neglect but from lack of time, and the Honda Civic sat in the driveway, its trunk still slightly open from a latch that didn't quite catch. Ryan parked across the street and waited. Military training had made him comfortable with waiting, with observation, with patience. At 7:45, the front door opened. A woman emerged, late 30s, tired, dressed in scrubs. Rachel Webb, heading to her day shift. She got into a Toyota Corolla that started on the third try and drove away. Ryan waited another 15 minutes. Then he approached the house and knocked. Marcus answered after a long delay. He looked worse than he had the night before, eyes hollow, unshaven, wearing sweatpants and a faded Marine Corps t-shirt. He stared at Ryan without recognition. "Can I help you?" Marcus's voice was flat, defeated. "Mr. Webb, my name is Ryan Cross. I'm a Navy SEAL. I was at the Northbridge Tower last night. I saw everything that happened." Marcus's expression didn't change. "Okay, I want to help you get your job back. I want to make this right." For the first time, something flickered across Marcus's face. Confusion, maybe. Or suspicion. Why? Because what happened to you is wrong. Because you're a veteran who deserves better. Because men like Thomas Northbridge Jr. only get away with this if nobody stops them. Marcus shook his head slowly. "It's done. I called a lawyer. He said I have no case. At-will employment, no contract. They can fire me for any reason. It's over." Ryan held up his phone. "I have video evidence of Thomas Northbridge admitting he fired you over the puppy incident. I have audio of him showing no remorse when told about your daughter's condition. I have a file documenting his pattern of abusive behavior toward employees. And I have contacts in media, law, and the veteran community who are ready to make this a very public story." Marcus stared at him. "Why would you do this?" Ryan met his eyes. "Because I know what it's like to feel powerless. Because I spent my career fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. And because I can't stand by and watch a good man get destroyed for doing the right thing." Something broke in Marcus's expression. His eyes reddened, his jaw trembled, and he looked away quickly. When he spoke, His voice was rough. "My daughter. She needs treatment. The insurance." "I know," Ryan said quietly. "We're going to fix it. But I need your permission to proceed. I need you to trust me." Marcus looked back at him, studied him. Ryan saw the combat veteran assessing, calculating, deciding whether to trust another warrior. Finally, Marcus nodded. "Okay, what do you need me to do?" Thomas Northbridge Jr. didn't sleep that night. He'd returned to his penthouse, poured himself another scotch, and spent hours pacing and replaying the encounter with a Navy SEAL. By dawn, he'd convinced himself it had been a bluff, an empty threat from someone who didn't understand how the world actually worked. At 8 a.m., he called Derek Vance. They needed to get ahead of this, needed to control the narrative before that SEAL could do anything with his supposed recording. Derek arrived at the penthouse within 20 minutes, looking as sleepless as Thomas felt. They sat in Thomas's living room. White leather furniture, original art, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and strategized. First priority, discredit the video if it surfaced. They could claim it was edited, taken out of context, that the SEAL was an unstable veteran with a grudge. Thomas had lawyers who specialized in reputation management, crisis PR firms that could spin anything. Second priority, ensure Marcus Webb stayed quiet. They'd have Titan Maintenance make him sign an NDA in exchange for a small severance payment. If he refused, they'd threaten legal action for theft of company property. The puppy had been on company premises, technically making it their property. Third priority, identify and isolate the SEAL. Derek would use Northbridge Capital security contacts to find out everything about Ryan Cross, where he was staying, who he'd talked to, what leverage they could apply. It was a good plan. A thorough plan. The kind of plan that had worked before when Thomas had faced problems. At 10 a.m., Thomas's phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Northbridge, this is Sergeant Melissa Torres, Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department. I'm calling regarding an incident at your building last night." Thomas felt a surge of satisfaction. Finally, someone official, someone who could arrest a SEAL for harassment and extortion. "Yes, officer, I'm glad you called. There was an incident last night involving a man who threatened and attempted to blackmail me. I have security footage and witnesses." There was a pause. "Sir, I'm actually calling about a different matter. We received a complaint from Marcus Webb alleging wrongful termination in retaliation for reporting an abandoned animal. He's filed a formal police report claiming you threatened him and used your influence to have him fired." Thomas's satisfaction evaporated. "What? That's absurd. He was fired for violating company policy. There's no retaliation. Mr. Webb has provided documentation, including text messages and a witness statement from a military service member who was present during the incident. We're obligated to investigate complaints of this nature, particularly when they involve potential violations of labor law and veteran protections." Thomas's hand tightened on his phone. "Who's the witness?" "I'm not at liberty to disclose that information at this time, but I would like to schedule a time for you to come in and provide your statement regarding the incident. I'll have my lawyer contact you," Thomas said coldly, and ended the call. He immediately dialed his corporate attorney, a man named Richard Hauser, who charged $800 an hour and earned every penny by making problems disappear. Richard listened to Thomas's explanation, asked pointed questions, and promised to handle the police inquiry. But when Thomas hung up, he didn't feel reassured. He felt hunted. At noon, Derek called. The news wasn't good. Someone had filed a complaint with the North Carolina Department of Labor alleging violations of disability accommodation laws in Marcus Webb's termination. The complaint cited Marcus's service-connected disability and claimed the termination was discriminatory. Thomas slammed his hand on his desk. This was escalating too fast. Every hour brought new problems, new agencies, new threats. The SEAL, Ryan Cross, was clearly behind it, coordinating attacks from multiple angles. At 2 p.m., Thomas's phone rang again. This time, it was the CEO of Titan Maintenance Services. The man was apologetic but firm, given the public attention the situation was receiving. There had apparently been social media posts about the incident. Veteran groups were getting involved. Titan was suspending its decision to terminate Marcus Webb, pending a full investigation. What public attention? Thomas demanded. There's been no media coverage. Social media, the Titan CEO explained. Someone had posted about a disabled veteran being fired for helping a puppy. The post had been shared thousands of times. Veteran organizations were calling Titan, demanding answers. The company's reputation was at stake. Thomas ended the call and immediately searched social media. There it was. A post from an anonymous account with a generic profile picture. The text described the incident in detail, called out Northbridge Capital by name, and linked to a petition demanding Marcus Webb's reinstatement. The petition had 30,000 signatures. How had this happened so fast? Thomas scrolled through the comments, his stomach sinking. People were furious. They were calling him a monster, a bully. Everything Marcus had called him to his face. Veteran groups were threatening boycotts. Clients were asking questions. Derek arrived again, summoned by Thomas's increasingly frantic calls. They huddled in Thomas's office, trying to contain the damage. Maybe they could negotiate privately with Marcus, offer him money to go away, make this disappear before it got worse. At 4 p.m., Thomas's assistant knocked on his office door. There were reporters in the lobby. They wanted a statement about the Marcus Webb situation. Thomas felt panic claw at his chest. This couldn't be happening. He was Thomas Northbridge Jr. He controlled the narrative. He controlled everything. But control was slipping through his fingers like water, and he didn't know how to stop it. At 6 p.m., the Charlotte Observer's website published a story. Charlotte CEO accused of firing disabled veteran over rescue puppy. The article detailed the incident, quoted multiple veteran advocates, and included a statement from a Navy SEAL who'd witnessed the confrontation. The article went viral within an hour. By 8 p.m., local TV news was covering it. By 9 p.m., it was trending on Twitter. By 10 p.m., Thomas's phone was ringing nonstop. Board members, investors, clients, all wanting to know what was happening and what he was going to do. Thomas sat in his dark office, Derek long since gone home, and stared at his computer screen. Every refresh brought more comments, more shares, more rage directed at him. His company's stock, they were privately held, but share value still mattered, was dropping as nervous investors questioned the leadership. His phone buzzed. Another unknown number. Thomas almost didn't answer, but he was too exhausted to care anymore. Mr. Northbridge, this is Ryan Cross. I think we should talk. Thomas felt something in him break. What do you want? I want you to understand something. You didn't just hurt Marcus Webb. You hurt his family. His daughter is fighting cancer, and you took away her father's ability to pay for treatment. You did that because your ego was bruised, because you needed to feel powerful. I don't need a lecture from you, Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. You're going to make this right. Tomorrow morning, you're going to hold a press conference. You're going to announce that Marcus Webb has been reinstated with full back pay and benefits. You're going to establish a fund to cover his daughter's medical expenses. And you're going to apologize publicly for your behavior. Thomas laughed bitterly. And if I don't, then this gets worse. Much worse. I have more than just a video from last night. I have documentation of your pattern of abuse toward employees. I have testimony from the woman who sued you for harassment. I have evidence of financial irregularities at your company. And I have contacts in federal law enforcement who are very interested in your SEC investigation. Thomas went cold. How do you know about that? I know a lot of things. I know you're scared right now. I know you're wondering how a janitor and a SEAL could bring down someone like you. The answer is simple. People like you only have power as long as nobody challenges you. Once someone does, once the light gets shined on your behavior, you're exposed. And exposure is fatal to predators. Thomas said nothing. What could he say? You have 12 hours, Ryan continued. Press conference at 10 a.m. Full reinstatement, medical fund, public apology. Or I release everything and you lose everything. Your reputation, your company, your freedom when federal investigators find what I've found. The line went dead. Thomas sat in the darkness, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and power that suddenly felt hollow, and realized he'd lost. Not gradually, not through business failure or bad luck, but completely, utterly, because he'd underestimated a janitor and a Navy SEAL who decided his reign of cruelty was over. At midnight, Thomas called his lawyer and told him to prepare a statement. They had a press conference to plan. Ryan Cross stood in his hotel room at 2 in the morning, 3 days after the confrontation at Northbridge Tower, and reviewed his operational plan. On the desk before him sat his laptop, open to multiple browser tabs, news articles, social media analytics, legal documents, and encrypted communication channels. His phone sat beside it, screen dark but notifications silenced rather than off. SEALs learned to stay connected even during rest periods. The media campaign had exceeded expectations. The story of the disabled Marine veteran fired for helping a puppy had struck a nerve with the public, particularly the veteran community. The petition for Marcus Webb's reinstatement now had over 200,000 signatures. Local news had run segments featuring interviews with other Northbridge Capital employees who'd faced Thomas's abuse. Their faces obscured, but their stories damning. But Ryan knew media attention was fleeting. Outrage burned hot and fast, then moved to the next controversy. If he wanted lasting change, real consequences for Thomas Northbridge Jr., he needed more than public anger. He needed legal action, financial pressure, and systemic accountability. He'd spent the last 72 hours building that framework. His first call had been to the FBI Charlotte field office, specifically to an agent he'd worked with during a joint Navy-FBI investigation of defense contractor fraud 3 years earlier. Ryan had explained the situation, focusing on the potential securities violations and the pattern of workplace abuse that might constitute a hostile work environment protected by federal law. The agent had been interested, promised to forward the information to appropriate divisions. Second, Ryan had contacted the North Carolina Bar Association regarding Derek Vance's role in the harassment. Lawyers had ethical obligations, and conspiring to violate labor law could result in professional sanctions. The bar had opened an inquiry. Third, Ryan had reached out to Northbridge Capital's largest institutional clients through back channels, veteran advocacy organizations that managed pension funds for former service members. He provided them with evidence of Thomas's abuse of a disabled veteran and suggested they might want to reconsider their investment relationship. 2 had already initiated fund withdrawal processes. Fourth, and most importantly, Ryan had connected Marcus Webb with a top employment attorney who specialized in veterans' rights and who'd agreed to take the case pro bono. The lawyer had filed suit in federal court alleging violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, wrongful termination, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The suit named both Northbridge Capital and Thomas personally, seeking damages and injunctive relief. It was overwhelming force applied from multiple vectors simultaneously, a classic SEAL tactic. Don't give the enemy time to adapt or respond. Strike hard, strike fast, strike from unexpected directions. But Ryan also knew that wounded predators were dangerous. Thomas Northbridge Jr. was cornered, his power base eroding, his reputation in ruins. Men like him didn't go quietly. They lashed out. They looked for revenge. Ryan had anticipated this, had planned for it. At 7 a.m., Ryan drove to the address Derek Vance had arranged 3 days earlier, a secure apartment building in Dilworth, one of Charlotte's affluent neighborhoods. The building featured controlled access, security cameras, and a doorman who screened all visitors. Ryan had rented a furnished unit on the 8th floor using a shell LLC, paying 6 months in advance. This was where Marcus Webb and his family were staying. Ryan had moved them here the morning after their first conversation. Marcus had been resistant. He couldn't afford luxury housing, couldn't accept charity. But Ryan had explained it wasn't charity. It was operational security. Thomas Northbridge Jr. knew where Marcus lived. He had resources, connections, and a proven willingness to hurt people who crossed him. Marcus's family needed to be somewhere Thomas couldn't easily reach them. Rachel Webb had understood immediately. She'd packed essentials for herself, Marcus, and Jasmine, who'd been discharged from the hospital 2 days earlier after a chemotherapy cycle. They'd moved into the apartment with gratitude and disbelief, still processing how their situation had changed so dramatically. Ryan knocked on the apartment door. Marcus answered, looking better than he had days earlier, showered, dressed, some color back in his face. Sleep and security did wonders. Morning, Marcus said. Come in. Rachel made coffee. The apartment was spacious, 2 bedrooms, full kitchen, living room with large windows overlooking the city. Jasmine was asleep in one bedroom, her medications lined up precisely on the nightstand. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, working remotely. She looked up as Ryan entered and smiled. "Any news?" she asked. Ryan accepted the offered coffee and sat. "Plenty. Thomas Northbridge is holding a press conference at 10. His lawyers reached out last night. They're offering full reinstatement with back pay, coverage of Jasmine's medical expenses up to $500,000, and a public apology." Marcus's eyes widened. That's everything." Ryan shook his head. "It's the beginning. The press conference is about damage control. He's trying to contain the bleeding, salvage his reputation. But the federal lawsuits are proceeding regardless. The SEC investigation has been accelerated, and 2 major clients have pulled $400 million from Northbridge Capital." Rachel leaned forward. "So it's working. He's facing consequences." "Real consequences," Ryan confirmed. "But he's also dangerous right now. Desperate. His lawyers are making the right moves, but Thomas himself is unpredictable. That's why you're staying here until this settles." "How long will that take?" Marcus asked. "Weeks, maybe months. The legal process is slow, but the immediate crisis should resolve soon. Once the press conference happens, once the reinstatement is public, Thomas loses his leverage. Anything he does after that just makes him look worse." Marcus sat down heavily. "I still can't believe this is happening. 3 days ago, I thought my life was over. Now you're getting justice," Ryan said quietly. "Because someone finally held a powerful man accountable. That's how it should work. That's how it should always work." Rachel reached across the table and squeezed Ryan's hand. "Thank you. I don't know how to properly thank you for what you've done." Ryan felt uncomfortable with the gratitude. He'd done what needed doing, what anyone should have done. "You don't need to thank me. You just need to keep fighting for your daughter. That's what matters." They talked for another hour, reviewing logistics. Marcus would return to work at Northbridge Tower the following week, assigned to different floors to avoid Thomas. The medical fund would be administered by a third party to ensure no strings were attached. The attorney would handle all legal communications, shielding Marcus from direct contact with Thomas or his representatives. Ryan left at 9, giving himself time to reach the press conference location. He wasn't planning to attend. Better to remain in the background, a faceless force that Thomas couldn't directly confront. But he wanted to be nearby, to monitor the situation, to respond if things went sideways. The press conference was held in a hotel ballroom downtown, hastily arranged but professionally staged. Ryan watched the live stream from his rental car, parked 2 blocks away. Thomas Northbridge Jr. appeared on camera looking diminished. He wore a dark suit, but it seemed to hang on him differently than it had days earlier. His face was drawn, eyes shadowed. Derek Vance stood beside him, along with a woman Ryan recognized as a crisis PR specialist. Thomas read from a prepared statement. His voice was flat, mechanical. He acknowledged that Marcus Webb had been wrongly terminated. He announced full reinstatement and the establishment of a medical fund. He expressed regret for his actions and committed to implementing new workplace policies to prevent future incidents. It was everything Ryan had demanded, but it felt hollow. Thomas's eyes never lifted from the paper. He took no questions. The moment the statement ended, he left the stage, handlers surrounding him like Secret Service agents protecting a president. Ryan watched the media reactions in real time. Most outlets framed it as a win for the veteran community, a rare example of accountability for corporate abuse. Some commentators noted that Thomas had been forced into the apology rather than offering it voluntarily, questioned his sincerity, predicted this wouldn't be the end of his problems. They were right. Ryan's phone buzzed. A text from his FBI contact. SEC moved up their timeline. Formal investigation announcement next week. Thanks for the tip. Another buzz. The employment attorney. Settlement talks with Northbridge Capital. They want to avoid trial. We'll keep you posted. Another. Marcus, I saw the press conference. Is it really over? Ryan typed his response carefully. The immediate crisis is over. But stay vigilant. Men like Thomas don't change. They just get better at hiding. He sent the text, then sat back in his car, watching people move through the downtown streets. Business professionals heading to lunch, tourists taking photos, normal people living normal lives, unaware of the small war that had just concluded in their city. Ryan thought about his team, currently preparing for deployment halfway across the world. Thought about the mission that awaited him, the objectives they'd pursue, the enemies they'd face. That was his world. Clear threats, defined enemies, straightforward solutions. But this, what he'd just accomplished with Marcus Webb, felt equally important. More important, maybe, because the threats here were insidious, systemic, woven into the fabric of society. And the enemies wore suits instead of carrying weapons, wielded money instead of guns. Someone had to fight them too. Ryan started his car and headed back to his hotel. He had 4 more days of leave before he had to report back to base. 4 more days in Charlotte. He wondered if that would be enough time to make sure Marcus and his family were truly secure. He suspected he'd find out soon enough. Thomas Northbridge Jr. sat in his penthouse that evening, curtains drawn against the city lights, and felt rage boil in his chest. The press conference had been humiliating. The forced apology had tasted like poison, and the knowledge that he'd been outmaneuvered by a janitor and a Navy SEAL ate at him like acid. Derek sat across from him, nursing a drink, looking nearly as defeated. They'd spent the afternoon with lawyers, financial advisors, board members. The news was uniformly bad. 2 more major clients were withdrawing funds. The SEC investigation was now public knowledge, causing stock volatility in related companies. 3 board members had suggested Thomas consider taking a leave of absence while the company stabilized. A leave of absence from his own company, the company his father had built. Thomas drained his scotch and poured another. Derek watched nervously. They'd known each other for years, had collaborated on countless schemes, had covered for each other's mistakes. But Derek's loyalty was pragmatic, not personal. If Thomas went down, Derek would distance himself, save his own career. Thomas understood this. He'd have done the same. But understanding didn't make it less bitter. "We need to do something," Thomas said finally. "We can't just accept this. Can't just let that SEAL destroy everything." Derek shifted uncomfortably. The lawyers were clear. Any retaliation would be catastrophic. "We're under too much scrutiny. Media is watching. If we go after Marcus Webb or Ryan Cross now—" "I don't care about Marcus Webb," Thomas interrupted. "He's nothing. But Cross. He's the one who orchestrated this. He's the one who needs to pay." "How?" Derek's voice rose slightly. "He's a Navy SEAL. He has resources, training, connections. What exactly do you think we can do to him?" Thomas smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We find leverage. Everyone has vulnerabilities. Family, friends, reputation. We dig until we find something. Then we use it." Derek set down his drink. "Thomas, listen to yourself. You're talking about going after a federal service member. That's not a business dispute. That's not a PR problem. That's potentially criminal." Thomas leaned forward. "He blackmailed me. He orchestrated a media campaign to destroy my reputation. He interfered with my business relationships. And you think I should just accept that?" "He gave you a choice," Derek said quietly. "You could have reinstated Marcus Webb immediately. Could have done the right thing. Instead, you chose to fight, and you lost. Now you need to accept the loss and move on." Thomas stared at his CFO, his supposed friend, and saw the distance opening between them. Derek was abandoning ship, calculating his own survival. Probably already had headhunters lined up for new positions. Probably already preparing to testify against Thomas if the SEC investigation led to charges. "Get out," Thomas said coldly. Derek blinked. "What?" "Get out of my home. You're done. I'll have your resignation letter drafted by morning." "Thomas, be reasonable. Get out." Thomas threw his glass against the wall. It shattered, scotch streaming down the expensive wallpaper, crystal fragments glittering on the floor. Derek stood quickly, backing toward the door. His face was pale, frightened. "You're making a mistake. You're letting anger control you. This is exactly what Cross wants, for you to do something stupid." Then he was gone, the penthouse door closing with a solid click. Thomas sat alone in his ruined living room, breathing hard, hands shaking. Derek was right, some distant part of his mind acknowledged. This was stupid, dangerous, self-destructive. But Thomas had never been good at accepting loss. His father had taught him that the world belonged to those willing to take it. That power was the only thing that mattered. Backing down, accepting defeat, these weren't options. These were weaknesses. Thomas pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He had resources Derek didn't know about. Connections in places Derek's suburban mind couldn't imagine. Private investigators who didn't ask questions. Security contractors who operated in gray areas of the law. People who solved problems for a price. He made a call. The voice that answered was neutral, professional. Thomas explained what he needed. Comprehensive background on Ryan Cross. Everything. Family, finances, relationships, past incidents. Anything that could be used as leverage or exposure. The voice quoted a price. Thomas agreed without hesitation. Money was just money. Pride was everything. The call ended with a promise. 24 hours for preliminary results. Thomas sat back, feeling his equilibrium return. This wasn't over. He'd been outmaneuvered in the opening moves, but the game was longer than Ryan Cross realized. Thomas had survived in the cutthroat world of finance for years. He knew how to fight, knew how to hurt people who hurt him. Ryan Cross had made a mistake engaging with Thomas Northbridge Jr. He'd created an enemy with resources and motivation. And now Thomas had something to focus his rage on, a target for his need to reassert dominance. Tomorrow, the investigation would deliver results. Then Thomas would decide how to proceed, how to hurt the SEAL without leaving fingerprints, how to make him regret ever stepping into that lobby. Thomas poured another scotch, stepped over the broken glass, and stared out his windows at the city below. Somewhere out there, Ryan Cross thought he'd won, thought he'd ridden off into the sunset, hero of his own story. He had no idea what was coming. Ryan's phone rang at 6 a.m. on the fourth day. He answered immediately. SEALs learned to wake instantly, fully alert, no matter the hour. It was his FBI contact. You need to see this. Ryan pulled up the link the agent sent. A local news report from overnight. Thomas Northbridge Jr. had been arrested at 3 a.m., taken from his penthouse by federal agents. The charges were insider trading, securities fraud, and obstruction of justice. The SEC investigation had accelerated dramatically, and prosecutors had decided Thomas was a flight risk, given his private wealth and foreign bank accounts. Ryan sat up in bed, processing. This had moved faster than he'd anticipated. The FBI must have found something significant, something that warranted immediate action, rather than the usual slow build of a white-collar case. Your tip helped, the agent said. When we started digging into Northbridge Capital's trading patterns, we found a network of shell companies and offshore accounts. Thomas had been running an insider trading scheme for 3 years, using confidential client information to make personal trades. The total fraud is estimated at $40 million. Ryan felt grim satisfaction. Thomas Northbridge Jr. hadn't just been a bully. He'd been a criminal. And now he'd face consequences for both. What happens now? Ryan asked. Arraignment this afternoon. Given the evidence, prosecutors are pushing for no bail. If they succeed, Thomas sits in lockup until trial. And with the media attention from the Marcus Webb situation, this is high profile. The U.S. Attorney's Office wants to make an example. Good, Ryan said simply. After the call, Ryan dressed and headed to the secure apartment where Marcus and his family were staying. They deserved to hear the news directly, not from television reports. Marcus answered the door, already awake. He'd seen the news. He stood in the doorway, expression complex, relief, disbelief, and something that might have been concern. Is it really over? Marcus asked for the second time in as many days. The immediate threat is over, Ryan confirmed. Thomas Northbridge faces federal charges that will likely result in years of prison time. Northbridge Capital is imploding. Board has moved to remove him as CEO. Clients are fleeing. The company might not survive. He can't hurt you anymore. Can't hurt anyone anymore. Rachel appeared behind Marcus, wrapping her arms around her husband's waist. She was crying, but her expression was fierce, triumphant. Good. He deserves it. Everything he did, everything he was. It finally caught up to him. Ryan nodded. The system doesn't always work. But sometimes, when enough pressure is applied, when enough light is shone on darkness, it does. What about you? Marcus asked. You're deploying soon, right? 2 days, Ryan confirmed. My leave is almost up. Thank you, Marcus said, his voice thick. Thank you for everything. You didn't have to help us. Didn't have to risk your time and reputation. But you did, and you changed our lives. Ryan felt uncomfortable again with the gratitude. I did what anyone should have done. But no one else did, Rachel said quietly. Everyone saw what Thomas was doing. Everyone knew he was cruel, abusive, corrupt. But no one stepped up. Not until you. They stood in the doorway for a long moment. 3 people from different backgrounds, connected by circumstance, and shared commitment to justice. Then Marcus extended his hand, and Ryan shook it. The grip of one veteran to another, respect and recognition passing between them. Ryan left the apartment and returned to his hotel. He had calls to make, loose ends to tie up. The employment attorney needed to be updated. The lawsuit would proceed, though settlement was likely now that Thomas's criminal exposure was public. The veteran organizations needed to be thanked for their support. The journalists who'd covered the story needed to be provided final context. By noon, Ryan had completed his checklist. The mission was essentially over. Marcus Webb had his job back. His daughter's medical care was secured, and Thomas Northbridge Jr. was facing the consequences of years of cruelty and criminality. Ryan should have felt satisfaction, should have felt that sense of completion that came from a successful operation. Instead, he felt restless, because he knew the victory was temporary, knew that for every Thomas Northbridge taken down, a dozen others operated with impunity, knew that the system that had allowed Thomas to flourish for so long remained fundamentally unchanged. But then his phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, and Ryan opened it to find a photo. Jasmine Webb, thin and pale from chemotherapy, but smiling, holding the German Shepherd puppy that had started everything. The puppy looked healthier too, clean, grooming, wearing a new collar. The caption read, "Her name is Hope." Jasmine named her. "Thank you for giving us both back." Ryan stared at the photo for a long moment. Then he saved it to his phone's photo library, tucked the device away, and headed out to walk the Charlotte streets one last time before his deployment. Maybe he hadn't changed the system, but he'd changed one family's trajectory, had shown one little girl that sometimes, when things seemed darkest, someone stepped up, someone fought back, someone cared. That was enough. That had to be enough. Thomas Northbridge Jr.'s arraignment was held in the federal courthouse downtown at 2 p.m. Ryan didn't attend, better to remain uninvolved now that federal prosecutors had taken over, but he monitored the proceedings through news coverage. Thomas appeared in an orange jumpsuit, hands shackled, looking nothing like the arrogant CO who'd shoved a janitor's cart 4 days earlier. His lawyers argued for bail, citing his community ties, his lack of criminal history, his cooperation with investigators. The prosecutor countered with evidence of hidden assets, foreign accounts, and communications, suggesting Thomas had been planning to flee the country if the investigation intensified. The judge denied bail. Thomas Northbridge Jr. would remain in federal custody pending trial. The courtroom erupted with whispers. Media cameras captured Thomas's face as the decision registered: shock, disbelief, rage, then something that might have been fear. He was escorted out by federal marshals, still shackled, and disappeared into the system that had seemed so distant from his privileged life. Outside the courthouse, Marcus Webb stood with Rachel and their attorney, surrounded by reporters. Marcus read a brief statement thanking everyone who'd supported his family, acknowledging the military service member who'd stood up when others stayed silent, and expressing hope that corporate America would learn from this incident. He didn't name Ryan, respecting his request for privacy, but the message was clear. One person's courage had started a chain reaction that ended with a powerful man in handcuffs. The news coverage that evening was wall-to-wall. Every network ran segments about Thomas Northbridge's fall from power. Analysts discussed the insider trading charges, the securities fraud, the obstruction of justice. But they also discussed the Marcus Webb incident, the puppy, the abuse of power that had drawn public attention to Northbridge in the first place. Some commentators noted that without the viral story of a disabled veteran being fired for helping a dog, the federal investigation might have proceeded slowly, quietly, possibly allowing Thomas to hide evidence or flee. The public pressure had accelerated everything, had forced prosecutors to move decisively. One reporter put it perfectly: sometimes justice requires a spark, someone willing to stand up, to shine light on darkness. In this case, that spark came from an anonymous Navy SEAL who saw wrong and refused to look away. Ryan watched from his hotel room, beer in hand, and felt that rare sense of completion settle over him. Not satisfaction. The cost had been too high for Marcus's family for satisfaction. But completion. Closure. The knowledge that he'd done what he'd set out to do. Thomas Northbridge Jr. would spend years in prison, if convicted. His company would collapse. His wealth would be seized. His reputation would be destroyed. Not because of one incident of cruelty, but because that incident had started an investigation that uncovered years of criminality. Sometimes bullies got away with it. Sometimes the powerful crushed the weak and faced no consequences. But sometimes someone fought back, and the whole rotten structure came crashing down. Ryan finished his beer, packed his bags, and prepared for the next morning's flight back to Virginia Beach. Back to his team, his deployment, his war. But this had been a war too. Different battlefield, different tactics. Same fundamental truth. Evil flourished when good people did nothing. Ryan Cross had done something, and Marcus Webb's daughter was alive because of it. That was all the victory he needed. 6 weeks later, Ryan Cross stood on the deck of a ship in the Pacific Ocean, somewhere he couldn't disclose, preparing for an operation he couldn't discuss. His team was around him, brothers in arms, men who trust him with their lives and whom he'd die to protect. This was his world, the one that made sense, where enemies were clear and objectives were defined. But his phone, secured in his personal locker, contained messages that connected him to another world. A civilian world he'd briefly touched and changed. Marcus Webb sent updates weekly. Jasmine's cancer was in remission. The medical fund had covered her treatment completely, removing the financial burden that had nearly destroyed the family. Marcus had been promoted to a supervisory position at Titan Maintenance, overseeing cleaning operations at multiple buildings. Rachel had been able to reduce her hours, spending more time with Jasmine during recovery. The puppy, Hope, had grown into a healthy young dog. She and Jasmine were inseparable. Thomas Northbridge Jr. had pled guilty to all charges as part of a deal with prosecutors. He'd been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of $40 million. Northbridge Capital had been dissolved, its assets liquidated to compensate defrauded clients. Derek Vance had testified against Thomas in exchange for immunity, then quietly left Charlotte to rebuild his career elsewhere. The system had worked. Slowly, imperfectly, but it had worked. Ryan didn't take credit. He'd been one catalyst among many. The journalists who'd covered the story, the veteran organizations that had applied pressure, the prosecutors who'd pursued charges, Marcus himself for having the courage to stand up. But he'd been the spark. The one who decided that this particular injustice wouldn't stand. And that decision had changed lives. Ryan had visited Marcus's family one last time before deploying. They'd invited him to dinner, a simple meal in their small house. Jasmine strong enough now to sit at the table. Hope curled at her feet. It had been uncomfortable in the way that gratitude always made Ryan uncomfortable. They'd thanked him repeatedly, offered to pay him somehow, asked how they could repay the debt they felt they owed. Ryan had stopped them. There's no debt. You survived something terrible, and you came out the other side. That's what matters. But you made it possible. Rachel had insisted. Without you, without me, someone else would have stepped up eventually. Ryan had lied. Because the truth was darker. Without him, Marcus's family would have been destroyed. Jasmine would have lost her treatment. Marcus would have spiraled into despair. Thomas Northbridge would have continued his reign of cruelty until he overreached against someone with more power. But saying that would have made them feel more indebted. And Ryan didn't want debt. He wanted them to live, to thrive, to be the good people they already were. Jasmine had asked him why he'd help them. She'd looked at him with eyes that had seen too much suffering for 17 years, and asked the question adults were too polite to voice. Ryan had thought about his answer carefully. Because I believe the purpose of strength is protecting those who need protection. I have training, resources, experience. Your dad had none of those things in that moment, so I used what I had to balance the scales. But you didn't have to, Jasmine had said. No, Ryan had agreed. I chose to. That's what makes it matter. Before he'd left, Marcus had walked him to his car. They'd stood in the driveway under a clear October sky. Two veterans from different branches and different wars, connected by shared values. I hope you stay safe out there, Marcus had said. Whatever you're doing, wherever you're going. Ryan had nodded. I hope you and your family stay safe here. And I hope you remember that you're not powerless. You never were. You just needed someone to believe in you for a moment. You gave us more than a moment, Marcus had said. You gave us our lives back. They'd shaken hands one final time. Then Ryan had driven away, leaving behind the city of his birth and the family he'd saved, heading toward the war that waited across the ocean. Now, standing on the ship's deck, Ryan thought about justice, about power, about the responsibility that came with both. He joined the Navy to serve his country, but service meant more than killing enemies and completing missions. It meant standing up for the values he'd sworn to protect: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Those weren't just words. They were principles worth fighting for, worth risking everything to defend. Marcus Webb had embodied those principles. A man who'd served his country, worked a menial job without complaint, shown mercy to a helpless animal, loved his family so fiercely he'd sacrificed everything for his daughter's survival. Thomas Northbridge Jr. had represented their opposite: cruelty, exploitation, the abuse of power for petty satisfaction. The confrontation between them had been inevitable, and Ryan had been the fulcrum, the point where power balanced against powerlessness and shifted the outcome. He'd do it again, would do it 1,000 times, because that was what service meant. Not just fighting foreign enemies, but fighting injustice wherever it appeared. Not just protecting American lives overseas, but protecting American values at home. The system didn't always work, but when good people refused to look away, when they used whatever power they possessed to defend those who couldn't defend themselves, sometimes the system could be made to work. Sometimes justice prevailed. Sometimes monsters faced consequences. Sometimes the good guys won. In a world where power protects power, sometimes justice requires someone willing to stand in the gap. Someone willing to risk comfort and safety to fight for what's right. Someone willing to say enough is enough. Marcus Webb was that person when he fed a starving puppy despite knowing it might cost him his job. He chose mercy over security. Ryan Cross was that person when he intervened to protect a veteran being crushed by a system designed to favor the powerful. He chose justice over anonymity. You can be that person too. When you see cruelty, speak up. When you witness injustice, act. When powerful people abuse those with less power, be the one who says it's unacceptable. Document it, report it, shine light on it. The world changes one intervention at a time. One person deciding they won't tolerate evil. One act of courage that inspires others. If this story touched you, share it. If you know someone facing injustice, be their voice. And always, always protect those who cannot protect themselves. Because the powerful aren't untouchable when the right person is watching. And sometimes, that right person is you. Somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, a Navy SEAL prepares for another mission. In Charlotte, North Carolina, a Marine veteran watches his daughter play with a German Shepherd puppy named Hope. And in a federal prison, a former CEO begins to understand the consequences of cruelty. The world is a little more just tonight. Not because systems are perfect, but because people chose to be courageous, chose to fight back, chose to stand up when it would have been easier to look away. Until next time, remember, justice doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone makes it happen. Someone like you. Someone like Marcus Webb. Someone like Ryan Cross. Be that someone. Until next time, remember, the powerful aren't untouchable when the right person is watching. And the right person might be you.